Review copy provided by Private Division. There are many exciting cyberpunk games coming out this year, featuring a futuristic aesthetic, transhumanist explorations, and masterful dialogue and storytelling. I'm Richard Jellison, and I'll be explaining why Disintegration is unfortunately not one of them. V1 Interactive has an interesting history, being founded by one of the co-creators of the Halo franchise, and focuses on high-quality but smaller form-factor games. I can understand wanting to create a high-concept sci-fi game, but it's hard stepping out of that shadow. However, the two games can't be further apart. In Disintegration, you play as Romer Scholl, an ex-professional flying motorcyclist whose mind has been integrated with a robotic shell, and after escaping the villains, leads a group of rebels towards revolution. You spend each game's mission on said flying motorcycle, shooting down enemy robots and commanding your squad, RTS style. You're floaty, but not necessarily speedy, which makes you a big target if you don't plan correctly. This gameplay scheme may not jive with all players, as it certainly didn't with me, but the skill ceiling on the tougher difficulties can be quite high. I failed my first encounter within seconds of engagement, so that means full frontal assaults are rarely, if ever, an option, which you have to take into account when you switch to this from a traditional shooter. There is strategic depth here. That I can definitely tell, but for somebody like me, who's loath to play the likes of your standard Command and Conquers, I had a hard time getting past some of the bigger set pieces. On medium or even story difficulty, you can almost beat each level on your own, but squad mastery is the crux of the game. Let me talk about gameplay for just a moment. The standard loop is enter an area, target the important enemies that you need to be killed first, keep an eye out for places where you can get a nanite health restoration, clear the area out, find your objective, and move on to the next place. The gameplay loop is incredibly simple, easy to grasp, and of course, as I said before, the skill ceiling is incredibly high, especially on the higher difficulties. You also have the ability to shoot a healing nanite boost directly at a teammate in order to A, heal them, and B, shorten their cooldown of their special ability, which you'll want to do pretty frequently considering they can deal much more damage than you can. However, if all of your squad is focusing fire on a single target, they can, most likely will, be taken out pretty quickly. But you can as well. You are a pretty soft target. However, you are the most mobile thing out there. You just have to make sure that your squad mates die instead of you. So send them out, boost in to pick them up, and boost back out, save their lives, and make sure that you remain unharmed. It's almost like it uses a proper RTS economy mechanic where the units you're sending out are much more expendable than your home base. It makes sense, really, in the context of what you're doing. Now, imagine you're flying a motorcycle and you have your squad directly below you. You see a group of enemies and you go to highlight one in order to focus all of your attack. Your indicator instead tells your squad mates to rush over to the point near that enemy because you didn't realize that there was a range limit on your pointer. This is one of the most frustrating things that I had to deal with through my time with the game. The enemy difficulty was hardly ever an issue, but the squad commands do need a slight amount of fine-tuning. If I'm able to see something, I should just be able to say, attack that target. It's not a special ability, which I can understand if it's throwing a grenade or some such, to have a certain amount of range on it. But if I can see an enemy, my squad should also be able to rush in and attack that enemy, especially since they're only AI, and it's not like I'm controlling any of them individually. Squad controls are not exactly the same as a regular RTS, which makes sense, as there are concessions that have to be made when switching to an active role instead of a commanding one. But it almost reminds me of Mass Effect. That isn't to say other games do these things better, it just isn't fresh or as new as the concept lent itself to be here. Speaking of your squad, you have a mix of character archetypes and classes that differs on each mission, leading to mixing and matching their special abilities during a firefight. And using upgrade points that you get from completing challenges, you can boost their potential even further. And despite talking to them between missions and spending a few hours listening to them chat and joke back and forth during these missions, I can't tell you their names off the top of my head. There's an annoyingly funny guy.
I remember thinking you were cool, man. You know, I integrated because of you. Kinda regret it now.
A serious large man.
You gonna stand around reminiscing, or are we gonna find that weapons cache you promised?
And the sniper character with the best crowd control ability in the game.
Keep putting it off and complaining to me when things don't work. Maybe we'd have decent comms if this place weren't such an outdated piece of shit.
It's unfortunate that the writing for these characters, who you spend a large amount of time listening to, is just pretty standard for a shooter. For the most part, they are forgettable and dull, like side characters in a Call of Duty. I wanted to like them over the course of my time with the game, but nothing really stood out enough to warrant me caring. As for the overall story, it's what you'd expect from a typical sci-fi. The main character assembles this ragtag team and through guerrilla tactics fights the big bad enemy force. It's just set dressing for the ability to fight other mechs and giant robots. It doesn't have to be deep, but it also just isn't compelling or gripping in any capacity. At least, not to me. Much like the story, the art style isn't distinct enough to get picked out of a lineup, and the enemies and robots all sort of look generic. There are clear inspirations from other high-profile games. Anthem and Halo come to mind, as does Destiny. From a design perspective, two of those make sense, as this is yet another studio with connections to Bungie's major IPs. My time with the game, lacking the usual day one patch, was buggy. Frames were dropping pretty inconsistently, and I had one major crash. The cutscenes were also not firing properly, and I had to spend an hour and a half on the first mission multiple times just to capture the pre- and post-mission cutscenes without these bugs. But maybe the game just wasn't meant for me. Not everything can be, or should be. This is taking a different form from other shooters out there, and I just happen to not like it much. For some of you out there, this could be a sleeper hit, or maybe the game you never knew that you wanted. For me, it's an RTS where you can take control of the battlefield yourself, and that just isn't my jam. If V1 is going to continue to make genre mashup games, I'd really like to see the results for their next few endeavors. They could really hit their stride and make a critical darling. As I sit here and write this review, it occurs to me that my issues here could just be growing pains from a new studio. I'd love to see them succeed, simply for my own curiosity of what else they can create. But if you can get that integration technology hooked up and ready to go in the next few years, feel free to put me high on the clinical trials list. I'm Richard for VGS.